Welcome to AP Biofauna with Dr. D. And in today's tutorial, we're going to talk about the origin of species. So when Darwin traveled to the Galapagos Island, what he found is that he found many different plant and animals that he could not find anywhere else on Earth. So these were unique species that were unique to the Galapagos Island. So speciation really is the process by which one species can split into two or more species. Speciation also explains that features are shared between organisms due to inheritance from their most recent common ancestor. Speciation, the process of speciation really forms a conceptual bridge between microevolution and macroevolution. Remember, microevolution is evolution on a small scale. We talked about it last week. It consists of changes in allele frequency in a population over time. Macroevolution is evolution on a large scale, and it refers to the broad patterns of evolution above the species level. So the word species in Latin means kind or appearance, and biologists used to and still do compare different organisms by morphology. That's how they look, by physiology, by biochemistry, and most recently by comparing DNA sequencing when grouping them. So the biological concept state of species states that species is a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable and fertile offspring. Now, these populations do not breed successfully with other populations. So by definition, if two populations cannot breed successfully, then they are different species. The gene flow between populations of the same species will hold the populations together genetically. So different species cannot reproduce successfully with each other. So this is referred to as reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is the existence of biological barriers that impede two species from producing viable and fertile offspring. You also need to know about hybrids. Hybrids are offspring of crosses between two very, very closely related but still different species. And hybrids are, we're going to talk a little bit more about hybrids later. Reproductive isolation can be classified by whether the barriers can act before or after fertilization. So we call them prezygotic barriers if these barriers happen prior to fertilization, and postzygotic if they happen after fertilization. So, and this comes from the word zygote. Remember, zygote is a fertilized egg. So zygote is the product of fertilization. So if it's prezygotic, it's pre-fertilization. If it's postzygotic, it's post-fertilization. So what prevents two different species from even making an attempt to mate? Well, habitat isolation is one. Another one would be temporal isolation and behavioral isolation. Now, if these are not in place and two species should attempt to mate, there's also mechanical isolation and gametic isolation. Now, let's assume two species can actually mate and fertilization occurs. What prevents them from producing viable and fertile offspring? Three different barriers. One of them results in reduced hybrid viability. That means the hybrids, which are the offspring of that mating, do not survive, or very few of them survive, or they don't survive long enough to reproduce. Reduced hybrid fertility. If that hybrid offspring is actually quite viable and robust, it can survive for a very long time. It is often infertile, so it cannot reproduce on its own. And finally, this is a concept that is observed in crops. It's hybrid breakdown. The hybrid offspring will break down. So the prezygotic barriers really block fertilization from actually happening in the first place. And they do so by impeding different species from attempting to mate, or once they mate, they prevent the successful completion of mating. Hindering fertilization is if mating is successful. So habitat isolation means that even though they may not be isolated by physical barriers, the two different species encounter each other very rarely or not at all. Temporal isolation has something to do with when a species produces gametes and when it is actually that it mates. So different species can mate at different times of the day, at different seasons, or even in different years. Behavioral isolation is usually observed in birds. Courtship rituals and other behaviors are unique to a species and are effective barriers of two different species of birds from mating, preventing them from mating. Mechanical isolation deals with morphological differences that prevent successful mating. So that those are external features, usually of sexual organs, that make two different species incompatible. And gametic isolation is when sperm from one species may not be able to fertilize the eggs of another species. And gametic isolation is very prominent in animals, and especially fish, who have external fertilization, where the female lays the eggs and then the male sperm fertilizes the eggs outside of the female body. So gametic isolation is quite common in these type of organisms. Postzygotic barrier prevent the hybrid zygote, the formed zygote from two different species, from developing into a viable and fertile adult by either reducing its viability, so it cannot survive long enough to reproduce, or if it does survive, it's not able to produce gametes itself, so it has a reduced fertility, and also by hybrid breakdown. Okay, an example of a reduced hybrid fertility are the mules, which are crossed between a horse and a donkey. Mules are actually very robust, they live long, and they're useful to humans, but they're not able to leave any offspring. So how does reduced hybrid viability come about? Well, the genes of the different parent species may interact and impair the hybrid's development and survival. The reduced fertility is usually observed in two species which are very closely related. So they're close enough so that they can produce a viable hybrid, but that hybrid cannot produce good gametes. It cannot produce viable gametes, so it is often sterile. Hybrid breakdown is when some first generation hybrids are fertile, but when they mate with one another, or they mate with another species, either with their parent species or with each other, the offspring, the next generation is feeble and sterile. So the first generation may survive, may even mate, but the second generation will not. Okay, so this is basically a summary of the prezygotic barriers and the postzygotic barriers. Okay. So this is all great, but there are limitations to the biological species concept. The biological species concept, as we have defined it, cannot be applied to fossils, because we cannot test whether one fossil is able to mate with another fossil and produce viable and fertile offspring, correct? So we cannot use that concept when classifying fossils as different species. The biological concept of species is also not applicable to asexually producing organisms. And that includes all prokaryotes, all types of bacteria. So we just cannot define a species using those same concepts. It is important to notice, though, that biological species concept emphasizes the absence of gene flow. However, gene flow can occur between distinct species. So there are other definitions of species, because we do need to be able to define an organism, a population of organisms, as a separate species. And if they don't conform to the biological definition, scientists often use other definitions. So other species concepts will emphasize the unity within species rather than their separateness from different species. So one of those concepts is the morphological species concept, which defines a species by its structural features. That is often actually used to identify bacterial species. It applies to both, although it applies to both sexual and asexual species. However, this is somewhat of a subjective criteria. Now, there is another concept which is actually quite well defined. That is the concept of the ecological species. It views the species in terms of its ecological niche. It applies to both sexual and asexual species, and it emphasizes the role of disruptive selection. We're going to talk more about disruptive selection later. And you will be able to better grasp this concept once we talk a little bit more about ecological niche. And then there's the phylogenetic species concept. The phylogenetic species concept defines a species as the smallest group of individuals on a phylogenetic tree. And we're going to see that once we start talking about phylogenetic trees. Again, it applies to both sexual and asexual species, but it can be difficult to determine the degree of difference required to separate species on a phylogenetic tree. Now, speciation, or the formation of new species, can take place with or without geographic separation. Speciation can occur in two different ways: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. You need to be familiar with both terms. Allopatric speciation forms when new species are geographically isolated, as shown in this simple model, when the population of fish is separated by physically. Sympatric speciation forms when a new species forms within a population that is not geographically separated. So allopatric is geographic separation. Sympatric, there's no geographic separation. In allopatric speciation, gene flow is interrupted when a population is divided into geographically isolated subpopulation. So for example, the flightless cormorant of the Galapagos likely originated from a flying species on the mainland. Regions with many geographic barriers typically have more species than do regions with fewer barriers. And reproductive isolation between the populations generally increases as the geographic distance between them increases. In sympatric speciation, and you're gonna remember the terms like this: allopatric is another country, or alien, AL. Sympatric is same country. In sympatric speciation, speciation takes place in populations that live in the same geographic area. Sympatric speciation occurs when gene flow is reduced between groups that remain in contact through factors including polyploidy, habitat differentiation, or even sexual selection. So sexual selection, remember, is a driving force of evolution. So polyploidy, what is that? Poly means many. Polyploidy is the presence of extra sets of chromosomes due to accidents during cell division. And you know accidents happen, we've talked about that. Polyploidy is much more common in plants than in animals. So an autopolyploid is an individual with more than two chromosome sets, which are derived from the same species. And the offspring of matings between autoploids and diploids have reduced fertility. So here's an example of a cell that has, whose 2n number is 6, so it has 3 chromosomes, 3 sets of chromosomes. The tetraploid cells will now have 4, double that, and will have 12 chromosomes. And the gametes produced by tetraploids can actually result in a new species, which has now completely different number of chromosomes. An alloploid is a species with multiple sets of chromosomes, which is derived from a different species. Alloploids cannot interbreed with either parent species. So this was polyploidy. Now, habitat differentiation, it means that speciation can result from appearance of a new ecological niche. So a population lives in the same geographical area, but things change. The environments are constantly changing. And if a new ecological niche appears, it will be filled. So for the example would be the American maggot fly. It can live on native hawthorn trees, as well as more recently introduced apple trees. And finally, sexual selection. Sexual selection can drive sympatric speciation. Sexual selection from mates of different colors has likely contributed to speciation of cichlid fish in Lake Victoria. So in summary, allopatric speciation, geographic isolation, geographic isolation restricts gene flow between populations. And that reproductive isolation may then arise by natural selection, genetic drift, or sexual selection in the isolated populations. Even if contact is restored between two populations, interbreeding is prevented now by reproductive barriers. So the two populations have become sufficiently distinct that reproductive barriers are in place, which means there are now two different species. Okay. Hybrid zones a hybrid zone is this concept of a region in which members of different species mate and produce hybrids. So in the process of speciation, two new species are still very closely related, and they can mate and produce hybrids. Now, hybrids are the result of mating between species with incomplete reproductive barriers. So they're so closely related to each other that their reproductive barriers are kind of not very good, essentially. So when closely related species meet in a hybrid zone, there's three possible outcomes. They can reinforcement, which means that reinforces the separateness of the two species. You can have fusion, which means the two species now become a new species, third species, or stability. Okay, so here's an example. Gene flow in a population, there's a barrier to gene flow, whatever that barrier is, whether it's geographic or not, and you end up with two species. In the hybrid zones, these two species can mate. The possible outcomes are reinforcement, they remain two different species, fusion, which means they are back to one species, or stability. So the two species are still two species, but they're closely related. Whereas, so the difference between stability and reinforcement is in stability, they're still closely related, and reinforcement, they are further diverging from each other. Okay, so reinforcement occurs when hybrids are less fit than the parent species. Okay, so when they're less fit than the parent species, we talk about reinforcement. Natural selection will strengthen, reinforce the reproductive barriers, and over time, the rate of hybridization will decrease. That means the two species are going to become more distinct. Where reinforcement occurs, reproductive barriers should be stronger from sympatric than for allopatric species. Fusion of the parent species into a single species may occur if hybrids are as fit as the original parents, allowing for substantial gene flow between the species. Okay. And this may be causing the fusion of many genes. And stability of the hybrid zone may be achieved if extensive gene flow from outside the hybrid zone can overwhelm selection for increased reproductive isolation inside the hybrid zone. In a stable hybrid zone, hybrids continue to produce over time. Okay. Final sentence. Macroevolution, evolution on a large scale, is the cumulative effect of many, not a single, not a few, but of many speciation and extinction events. So we're going to explore extinction events in next class. For now, this is it for me. Have a great day. Goodbye.